The spark before the storm. The sun hung low above Los Angeles, painting the sky with soft orange light. Inside a quiet community center, Keanu Reeves stood near a group of young volunteers, gently folding blankets for a relief drive. His calm presence filled the room with quiet warmth. Everyone respected him not for his fame, but for his humility. As he stacked the last box, a voice called from behind. It was Sandra Bullock, smiling in her worn denim jacket, carrying trays of food she had cooked herself. She said softly, "The earthquake victims will need comfort more than applause." Keanu nodded with his signature quiet smile, replying, "Then let's give them both, hope and help." The atmosphere was peaceful, almost sacred. Cameras were not allowed, no reporters, no fame. Just two people driven by the same purpose, kindness. They worked side by side for hours, serving food, carrying supplies, comforting strangers. Yet something unspoken hung between them. It was not love, not yet, but something deeper. Trust born out of silent respect. As the night grew darker, a sudden tremor shook the ground. Boxes fell, lights flickered, and people screamed. Keanu rushed forward, shielding a child from falling debris. Sandra held the injured woman's hand, whispering calm words. The earth's shaking stopped after seconds, but it left behind chaos and fear. Keanu looked at Sandra. She was trembling slightly but focused. He said quietly, "We can't leave yet. More people might be trapped." She nodded instantly. Both grabbed flashlights and stepped outside into the cold night. The street was filled with dust and broken walls. Sirens wailed in the distance. They started helping rescue workers without a second thought. Keanu climbed through a cracked doorway to pull out an old man who couldn't walk. Sandra tore part of her sleeve to wrap around a bleeding arm. Sweat and dust covered their faces, but their determination never faded. When a firefighter shouted that a building nearby might collapse, Keanu stopped Sandra. "You stay back," he said firmly. She shook her head, eyes fierce. "Not a chance." And before he could argue, she ran toward the trapped voices. He followed, helpless but proud. Together, they reached a small apartment building that leaned dangerously. Inside, two children were crying for their mother. Keanu crawled in first, using his jacket to shield himself from falling plaster. Sandra followed, whispering softly to the children. "We're here, don't be afraid." Minutes felt like hours. Finally, they pulled the children out safely. As they stepped into the street, the crowd cheered, but Keanu and Sandra didn't smile. They just looked at each other, breathing hard, understanding that this was only the beginning. The next morning, news channels showed images of their bravery, calling them heroes, but both refused interviews. When asked why, Sandra simply said, "Real heroes are the ones who lost their homes, not us." Keanu added quietly, "We only did what every heart should do." Yet deep inside, both knew something had changed forever. A bond had formed. Not from fame or films, but from shared pain and purpose. And that bond would soon be tested in ways they never imagined. The unspoken promise, the following week, brought calm skies but heavy hearts. Los Angeles was slowly healing, yet the memories of that night refused to fade. Keanu spent his mornings at the relief camp, fixing tents and carrying food supplies. Sandra joined him every day, wearing the same dusty jacket, her smile gentle but tired. They spoke little, yet their silence said everything. Sometimes Keanu would hand her a bottle of water without a word. Sometimes she would quietly fix his bandaged hand while pretending not to notice his pain. These were not romantic gestures, but something deeper. Respect built through shared struggle. One afternoon, as they sat on the back steps of the camp, Sandra finally broke the silence. "You know, we can't fix the whole world," she said softly. Keanu looked at her and replied, "No, but we can fix one corner at a time." She smiled faintly, her eyes glimmering in the soft sunlight. A young volunteer ran up to them. "Sir, ma'am, there's a message for you both," he said, holding a paper. It was an invitation from a local foundation asking them to lead a new mission, rebuilding a school destroyed in the quake. Keanu and Sandra exchanged glances. Neither hesitated. Both knew what their answer would be. The next morning, they arrived at the ruins of the school. Broken walls, scattered books, and children's drawings covered in dust. Sandra knelt down, picking up a torn sketch that showed a smiling teacher. She whispered, "We have to rebuild this place." "They need hope." Keanu nodded. "We will," their mission began quietly. Keanu used his savings to buy tools and materials. Sandra organized volunteers and reached out to local families. Days turned into nights as they worked side by side. Sometimes they laughed when things went wrong. Sometimes they cried when memories hit too hard. But every day the school began to rise again, one brick at a time. One evening, as they painted the new walls, a little girl approached them holding a flower. She said shyly, "Thank you for giving us our school back." Sandra smiled and placed the flower behind the girl's ear. Keanu crouched and said, "Just promise us you'll never stop learning." The girl nodded, her eyes full of innocence and gratitude. That night, under the dim light of the campfire, Sandra looked at Keanu and said, "Why do you always choose the hardest path?" Keanu took a deep breath before answering, "Because sometimes the hardest path leads to the most honest place." His voice was calm, but Sandra could feel the weight behind his words. She wanted to ask what pain he carried, what loss made him this humble, but she stopped. Instead, she just said, "Whatever happens, we finish this together." He looked at her for a long moment and smiled. Together. The next day, while construction continued, a government official arrived at the site. His tone was cold. "You don't have permission to rebuild here," he said sharply. "This land is being sold for development." The words hit like thunder. Sandra stepped forward. "You can't just erase their school," she said, her voice trembling with anger. The official shrugged. "Orders are orders." Keanu's eyes hardened. He calmly said, "Then we'll fight those orders." Sandra looked at him, both scared and inspired. Something had shifted again. This was no longer just about bricks or classrooms. It was about standing up for what was right. That night, as the wind howled outside their tents, Keanu sat staring into the fire. Sandra approached quietly and asked, "Do you think we can win this?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "We don't need to win, we just need to not give up." His words hung in the air, heavy but powerful. The world had tested them once with the quake. Now it was testing their courage. As the fire flickered, Sandra whispered, "Then let's fight, Keanu, for them." He looked at her and nodded, "For them." And in that moment, two hearts silently made a promise. Not to each other, but to the world they were trying to protect. The wall of silence. The morning sun broke through the haze as Keanu and Sandra walked into the city office. The air inside was cold and tense. Papers shuffled, voices murmured, and no one looked them in the eye. They carried documents, petitions, and photos of the half-built school. Sandra held the folder tightly, her hands trembling slightly. The clerk at the counter barely glanced up. "You need clearance from the urban board," he said in a dull tone. Keanu replied politely, "We've been there. They sent us here." The man shrugged and pointed to another desk. "Then you'll have to try again next month." Sandra's patience cracked. "Children are waiting," she said, her voice rising. "They don't have next month." The man looked annoyed and muttered, "That's not my problem." Keanu placed a calm hand on her shoulder, whispering, "Let's not fight here." "Not like this." They walked out in silence. Outside, the city noise felt louder than ever. Cars honked, people rushed, and the world moved on, unaware of their quiet battle. Sandra exhaled deeply. "It's like talking to walls," she said. Keanu nodded slowly. "Then we'll climb them." Over the next week, they met journalists, officials, and community leaders, but no one wanted to help. Some smiled politely, others avoided them entirely. The land deal was backed by powerful businessmen, and no one dared interfere. Every door they knocked on closed tighter than the last, yet every night they returned to the camp. The children greeted them with laughter. The volunteers waited for direction, and the unfinished school stood like a wounded soldier refusing to fall. Sandra looked at the structure one evening and whispered, "It deserves to live." Keanu replied softly, "Then we'll make sure it does." One day, while Keanu was helping mix cement, an old man approached him quietly. He was a retired architect who had heard about their mission. "I know someone," the man said, "a journalist who still believes in truth. She might help." That night, in a dim cafe, Keanu and Sandra met the journalist, a young woman named Leah. She listened carefully, taking notes as they explained everything. After a pause, she said, "If this story is true, people need to hear it." Sandra looked hopeful. "Will you publish it?" Leah nodded. "I'll try. But once it's out, there's no turning back." 2 days later, headlines spread across local news. Actors rebuild school against government orders. It became viral. People online praised their courage, but powerful voices grew angry. A government spokesperson called their actions unauthorized interference. Within hours, the construction site was raided. Officials arrived with bulldozers and armed guards. Volunteers were forced to step back. Keanu tried to reason with them, showing permits and documents, but one officer pushed him aside roughly. Sandra shouted, "This is wrong! You're destroying their future!" The officer ignored her. The sound of metal scraping concrete filled the air. The wall they had painted together cracked and fell. Children cried as dust rose around them. Keanu clenched his fists but didn't fight back. Instead, he turned to the camera crew that had arrived with the journalist. "Record this," he said firmly. "The world should see what happens when kindness is silenced." The footage spread faster than anyone expected. Millions watched as bulldozers crushed the half-built classrooms. Outrage filled social media. People demanded justice. But behind the noise, Keanu and Sandra sat quietly among the ruins. She looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "We lost," she whispered. Keanu shook his head slowly. "Not yet." He stood up, his face calm but fierce. "They can break walls, not hearts," he said. Sandra wiped her tears and looked at him with renewed fire. "Then we build again, even if we have to start from dust." And that night, under the broken roof of what was once hope, two silhouettes stood side by side, their shadows long against the moonlight. They didn't speak, but their silence carried a message. This was not the end. The storm before dawn, the world had seen their defeat. But Keanu and Sandra were not finished. The destroyed school became a symbol online, and thousands began following their story. Strangers sent messages of support, donations, and offers to help rebuild. But behind the public attention, danger quietly grew. One late evening, as Sandra packed relief supplies in the camp, she noticed a black car parked across the road. The same car had been there the last 2 nights. She tried to ignore it, but unease crept into her chest. Keanu arrived moments later carrying water bottles. She whispered, "Someone's watching us." He glanced toward the car but said calmly, "Let them watch. We have nothing to hide." The next day, they received a letter with no signature. It read, "Stop your campaign or face consequences." Sandra's hands shook as she held it. Keanu read it silently, then folded it and placed it in his pocket. "We keep going," he said. "Fear only wins when we stop moving." Over the next week, they organized peaceful marches and community gatherings. People of all ages came holding banners that read, "Education is not for sale." The streets filled with chants and hope. Sandra spoke to the crowd, her voice trembling but strong. "We are not against anyone," she said. "We are standing for children who cannot speak for themselves." Keanu stood behind her, his quiet presence grounding everyone. He didn't give speeches, but his every gesture spoke volumes. When reporters asked why he was risking his career, he simply answered, "Because silence would make me smaller than I can bear to be." That night, as they walked back to the camp, police cars blocked the road. Officers stepped out, faces stern. One officer approached and said, "Mr. Reeves, Miss Bullock, you are being detained for unlawful protest." The crowd gasped. Sandra's eyes widened. "We didn't break any law," she said firmly. "We only raised our voice," the officer replied coldly. "Sometimes that's enough." Keanu looked at her calmly and said, "It's all right." They were taken into custody, surrounded by flashing lights. Inside the small holding room, the air was heavy. Sandra sat quietly, her hands clasped. Keanu looked at the wall, deep in thought. After an hour, an officer entered holding a file. "You can walk free," he said, "but you must end this mission." Keanu looked up slowly. "No," he said simply. Sandra stared at him, knowing what that meant. The officer smirked and left the room. When they were released later that night, it was raining. They walked through the empty streets, soaked but unbroken. Sandra finally spoke. "You could have agreed, you know." "We could have walked away." Keanu shook his head. "If we walk away now, the next voice that speaks will be crushed before it even begins." She looked at him, eyes filled with both admiration and worry. "You never stop, do you?" she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Neither do you." The following morning, something unexpected happened. The journalist, Leah, appeared at the camp carrying a small envelope. "Someone sent this to our office," she said, handing it to Sandra. Inside was a single photograph, an image of a wealthy developer shaking hands with a government official, the same man who had ordered the demolition. Behind them was a blueprint marked Commercial Complex. Leah's eyes were sharp. "This is proof," she said. "They're selling the school land for personal gain." Keanu's jaw tightened. "Then we go public," he said. No more silence. The next 24 hours were a storm. The photograph leaked online, triggering outrage worldwide. Television channels replayed clips of the school's destruction, interviews with volunteers, and the emotional cries of children. The government tried to deny it, but truth travels faster than power. Protests erupted in several cities. People demanded that the land be returned. Amid all the chaos, Sandra sat quietly beside Keanu. "You know they'll come after us harder now," she said. He nodded. "I know. But maybe this time we won't be alone." The next day, thousands gathered outside City Hall holding candles. It wasn't just about a school anymore. It was about justice, truth, and courage. Sandra walked among the crowd, her eyes glistening with tears. Keanu stood on the steps, speaking softly into the microphone. "When kindness stands tall, even darkness listens," he said. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for that moment, a message arrived on his phone. It was from an unknown number with a single line, "Meet me tomorrow at dawn." "Come alone." Keanu showed it to Sandra. Her heart skipped a beat. "Do you think it's a trap?" she asked. He looked out toward the sea of candles and whispered, "Only one way to find out." And before the first light of dawn, he quietly walked into the unknown, unaware that what awaited him would change everything. The truth in the shadows. Keanu walked through the fog-covered streets before dawn, the air thick and silent. The message on his phone replayed in his mind. "Meet me tomorrow at dawn." Come alone. He didn't tell Sandra where he was going, not because he didn't trust her, but because he didn't want her in danger. The city was still asleep when he reached the old train yard. Rusted rails stretched across the empty ground, and the sound of dripping water echoed faintly. Suddenly, a voice came from behind a column. "You actually came." A man stepped out of the shadows, wearing a gray coat and dark glasses. Keanu recognized him immediately. He was the same official who had ordered the demolition. Keanu's fists tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "What do you want?" The man looked around cautiously, then said, "I didn't send that message. Someone else did." "They used my name." Keanu's confusion deepened. "Then who did?" he asked. The man sighed heavily. "Someone inside your own circle. Someone who knows your plans before you even announce them." Keanu's heartbeat quickened. "Why should I believe you?" he asked. The man pulled a small flash drive from his pocket and dropped it on the ground. "Because the truth will destroy you before it saves you," he said quietly. Then he turned and disappeared into the fog. Keanu stared at the flash drive lying on the wet ground. He hesitated, then picked it up and left quickly. By the time he reached the camp, the sun had begun to rise. Sandra was already awake, pacing near the tents. When she saw him, she ran up and said, "Where were you?" "I was worried." Keanu handed her the flash drive. "Someone wants us to see this," he said. They connected it to a laptop inside the tent. The screen flickered, showing a folder labeled Truth. Inside were documents, emails, and video clips. As they opened them one by one, their faces turned pale. The files showed that their entire mission, the permits, the protests, even the demolition, had been manipulated. A powerful corporation had planned everything from the beginning to create chaos, and then buy the land at a lower price. Worse, one of the foundation members who invited them to rebuild the school was secretly working with that corporation. Sandra covered her mouth, her eyes wide. "They used us," she whispered. Keanu closed his eyes, his jaw clenched. "They turned kindness into a tool," he said bitterly. Before they could process it all, Leah, the journalist, entered the tent. "You need to see this," she said urgently. She turned on her tablet, showing a news alert. Arrest warrant issued for Reeves and Bullock in connection with property fraud investigation. Sandra's voice cracked. "They're blaming us." Keanu stood still for a moment, his mind racing. "That's why they sent me the message," he said quietly. "Someone wanted me to know the truth before they buried it." They packed their bags and left the camp before police arrived. As they drove toward the outskirts of the city, Sandra's hands trembled on the steering wheel. "Where do we even go now?" she asked. Keanu looked out the window and said, "Somewhere we can still fight. Not with fame, not with words, with proof." They stopped at a quiet roadside diner, exhausted. Leah joined them there, bringing her laptop. "If we release these files now," she warned, "they'll come after us harder. But if we wait too long, they'll erase everything." Keanu looked at Sandra. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "We don't wait," she said firmly. "We do what's right. We finish what we started." Leah nodded and began uploading the files to global media servers. Each document carried truth like fire. As the data spread, their names once again filled headlines: heroes or criminals, truth or trap. By nightfall, the story exploded. Whistleblowers from inside the corporation came forward, confirming everything. People began protesting not just for the school, but against corruption. But just when it seemed they had won a moral victory, everything took a dark turn. Leah's car was found abandoned on a highway outside the city. Her laptop was missing. Sandra's eyes filled with fear. "They took her," she whispered. Keanu's expression hardened. "Then we go find her," he said. "We don't let truth die in silence." As they stepped out into the stormy night, lightning flashed across the sky, casting their shadows long and sharp. Two hearts, bruised but unbroken, walking into danger once again, not for glory, not for fame, but for the mission that bound them together. The last light rain poured heavily as Keanu and Sandra drove down the empty highway. Thunder echoed over the hills, and lightning flashed across the clouds. Leah's car had been found near an abandoned power plant on the city's edge. Keanu's voice was steady but cold. "Whoever took her wants to send a message," he said. Sandra nodded, clutching the map tightly. "Then we'll send one back." They stopped the car near the entrance and stepped out into the storm. Broken glass and metal scattered across the ground. Inside, the dim glow of a single light flickered in the distance. Sandra whispered, "This place feels wrong." Keanu glanced around, scanning every corner. "Truth always hides where no one dares to look," he said softly. As they moved deeper inside, they found Leah tied to a chair, her face bruised but defiant. "They wanted me to delete everything," she said weakly. "I stalled them, but they're coming back." Keanu quickly untied her ropes while Sandra held her close. "You did enough," Sandra said gently. "You're safe now." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed. A group of men entered from the far side of the hall, security from the corporation, armed and angry. Their leader stepped forward, his voice cold and arrogant. "You should have stayed quiet," he said. "This isn't your fight." Keanu stepped in front of Sandra and Leah. His voice was calm, almost whispering. "It became our fight the day you crushed those children's dreams." The man smirked. "You're just an actor. You don't belong here." Keanu looked him in the eye. "No, I'm a human, and that's enough." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then faintly, sirens began wailing in the distance. Leah smiled weakly. "I sent the location before they caught me," she said. "The police are coming." panic spread among the guards. They tried to flee, but the storm outside made it impossible. Police cars surrounded the plant minutes later. The officers stormed in, arresting the men who had kidnapped Leah. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to fade. The first rays of sunlight spilled through the broken roof. Sandra stood near the doorway, breathing deeply. Keanu walked up beside her, soaked and tired, but smiling faintly. "It's over," she whispered. Keanu looked at the sunrise and said softly, "No, it's just beginning." Later that week, the files they recovered from Leah's laptop were released worldwide. Every corrupt deal, every false report, every name was exposed. The corporation collapsed under investigation, and the government returned the land to the people. The school was rebuilt again, this time with stronger walls and thousands of hands helping. Children painted bright murals on the classrooms. Sandra stood watching them, her eyes filled with tears. Keanu joined her, carrying a bucket of paint. "We built it twice," he said, smiling. "Maybe that's how strong things are born." During the school's opening ceremony, reporters surrounded them, eager for quotes. But Keanu raised his hand and said quietly, "This was never our story. This was the story of every person who refused to give up." Sandra placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You taught them what courage looks like." He smiled faintly. "No, they taught me what hope feels like." When the ceremony ended, the crowd began to leave, but Keanu stayed behind. He looked at the schoolyard, children laughing, teachers smiling, the sound of life returning. Sandra stood beside him, sunlight glowing on her face. She asked softly, "So what now?" He looked at her and replied, "We keep going. There will always be another wall to break, another heart to heal." She smiled and said, "Then 2 hearts, 1 mission, still stands." They walked out together into the morning light, their clothes still dusty, their hearts finally at peace. Far behind them, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the air, the sound of victory, not through power but through kindness. And as the golden light touched their faces, it felt like the world itself was whispering the same truth they had fought for, that even in the darkest night, 2 kind hearts can bring back the dawn.